Perhaps you have heard the adage, bad decisions make the best stories. My older brother is an emergency physician in North Carolina. He could and would readily give the anecdotal support for that adage. Frequently, his best stories involve campers at the infield of the Coca-Cola 600. It is not pretty. Knowing all of his stories through the years, one year I decided to give him for Christmas a copy of the Darwin Awards. Are you familiar with the Darwin Awards? It's really quite a horrible book. I don't recommend you go out and buy it. It is case studies of folks who remove themselves from the gene pool in rather spectacular fashion. The case studies themselves are, in fact, in many cases quite tragic. They're not a good read, but it's the near misses that can be enormously entertaining and indeed can be the best stories. One good example is of an environmentalist whose sensibilities I happen to share, by the way, who wanted to make a point of conservation by depriving people of electricity, which he contrived to do by sawing through a 69,000 volt line with a tree saw, wearing dishwashing gloves for insulation. Apparently, with excellent medical care, he has suffered no permanent damage. Anyway, I gave this book to my brother one year for Christmas, and he said, "I don't need to read this. My job is fighting natural selection every single day." Of course, the point of that book, the reason it sells copies, the reason it's fun to read, is because we all know that bad decisions are really only funny when nobody loses an eye. The same is true of what defiles a person. If you think the matter of defiling oneself is a cheery topic for a Labor Day Sunday morning, I can assure you it was no cheerier when I sat down to write this week. I don't know that we often give much consideration as a matter of weekly course to the topic of defilement. But maybe it's not a bad thing for us to consider as we prepare to come to the Lord's table. We encounter opportunities all through our lives every day to defile ourselves. In the city where I once lived, I drove past a series of bars of ill repute every single day on my way to work. One day as I was driving past, the marquee out front read, "Just like Cheers." But I thought to myself, given what goes on in there, somehow I don't think they really do want to go where everybody knows their name. You and I both know the truth. There's really nothing funny about defilement. This morning we encountered two different perspectives on defiling oneself in Mark's gospel. First, we have the Pharisees assessing the behavior of the disciples. And then we have Jesus' rebuttal of their point of view. The first we have, according to Jesus, a human construct, a social pressure to observe the niceties of ritual hand washing. Now, mind you, I have nothing against hand washing. We should all wash our hands quite frequently. But the Pharisees were not concerned about hygiene. They were talking about faith practice. And what's important to remember about the Pharisees, the reason they are so often Jesus' conversation partner, is that they were concerned with making faith accessible. They wanted everyone practicing the Jewish faith to know exactly how to practice it, to remove the guesswork from faithful living so that everyone could do exactly what the Deuteronomy lesson told us to do, to keep these words, to keep the law. But the problem is, that's not what happens in the story we read this morning, not from the Pharisees this time. What we receive from the Pharisees in the portion we read this morning is a gotcha game being played with the law. The law which God gave with meaning and purpose to provide a basis for community for God's people, to create a community that showed by its behavior who the God it worshiped is. But instead, we encounter an arbitrary metric being imposed to determine what constitutes acceptable behavior. And it is followed by Jesus' sharp rebuttal. It's an interesting rebuttal, particularly because Mark, who rarely interprets the story for his readers, tells us that by this rebuttal, Jesus is declaring all foods clean. It's one of those clarifying moments in the gospel. It's Jesus saying to his disciples and to all of the Pharisees at the same time, get your eye on the ball. Pay attention to what is important to God. Don't get caught up in the minutiae, but pay attention to where God is calling us to go. And then Jesus goes about defining defiling. If you ever needed a primer on how to defile oneself, here it is. It appears to be a semi-systematic listing of paradigmatic things one can do to defile oneself. I call it semi-systematic because it's not exhaustive. There are plenty more things one can do to defile oneself. But here's what strikes me about it. Everything on this list is a way to devalue or denigrate yourself or someone else. Everything on this list is a great way to be less than God created you and me to be. Nobody ever sets out to be less than God created us to be, do we? It seems always to creep up. It starts with perhaps an insecurity or a hang-up. It moves into a crushing need for affirmation. Then, of course, temptation sidles up, and it's often disguised as opportunity. So it slides into decision and slinks into action. You read the list. Who among us would set out to do those things? You know, Jesus seems to single out fornication and adultery as great examples of defiling oneself. I suspect he chose these behaviors because he knew how destructive to self and to others these particular behaviors can be. They are community destroyers precisely because one cannot do them by oneself. And they are humanity destroyers because they make us less than we were created to be. In nearly 20 years of parish ministry, I have never once had someone say in their premarital counseling that they thought they might one day be unfaithful to their spouse. And yet there's an app for that. There are several, actually. Well, the truth is, I'm not particularly interested in psychoanalyzing the architecture of an extramarital affair, nor am I particularly interested in classifying persons as defiled or not. And my suspicion is that none of you are either. We are interested in understanding redemption. The Pharisees wanted to reduce faithfulness to a practice, a ritual practice of hand washing and the like, whatever little rituals people come up with to dictate what makes a person a good person or a bad person. But Jesus was calling on these Pharisees, these conversation partners of his, to go deeper, to risk encountering what it means to be human, and to take a hard look at what really diminishes our humanity. To do so, he targets a few behaviors as representative, but make careful note of this. Nowhere does Jesus say that these things make a person good or bad. He talked about what makes us less than we are created to be. Behaviors can lift us up, and behaviors can tear us down. What we do does make a difference. But behaviors can never define our ultimate worth. To put it colloquially, you can defile yourself 6 ways from Sunday, and I hope you won't, but you can never make yourself less than a beloved child of God, because God has made you to be that. Jesus wants us to go deeper in our own faith than simply hand washing. He wants us to understand our behaviors and our feelings. He wants us to understand what diminishes our own humanity and that of others. And I'm very aware that it's easy to talk about such esoteric terms as humanity and defilement and to leave it way up in the air, esoteric really, as to what makes for goodness and faithfulness. I think that's probably why Jesus is so very concrete in what he gives as examples. Because discernment in our common life together and in our individual lives as disciples is about asking concrete questions of our behaviors. If you want to know how to live a life that shows people that you are a follower of Jesus Christ, well, behavior does matter. So to get specific, here are a few sample questions that we can use to interrogate our lives to see whether our behaviors are fitting of disciples of Jesus Christ. Some of these will probably sound very familiar to you. I think you've probably heard them in many different contexts, but think of them as a primer for the Christian life. If Jesus gives us, on the one hand, a primer on how to defile oneself, he gives us, more importantly, a primer on how to live deeply, authentically human lives. Listen. Is what I'm about to do kind? Is what I am about to do or say helpful? Will the action I am about to take prove over time to have been necessary? Is it kind? Is it helpful? Is it necessary? Here are a few others. 30 seconds after I hit send, am I going to regret this email? What might I be about to damage or destroy? Here's one that I've used through the years. When I am sitting at the age of 90 on the porch at the home and I look back over my life, am I going to regret what I'm about to do? Now, it would be very easy to take this passage today and turn it into an object lesson. Do this, don't do that. And as object lessons go, it's a pretty useful one because, truthfully, behavior should have limits. But if all we do today is to consider the reasonable limits of human behavior for the reduction of suffering, we can answer those questions with Aristotle's Ethics. But if we want to go more deeply into the life of Christian discipleship, then we need to look at our lives and to consider what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. This is not a passage about nonsensical non-choices. Should I be nice or should I be a jerk? I hope the answer to that is abundantly clear to all of us. Do I really want to destroy this person's sense of feeling valued, or am I just out for myself? If it were so plain and clear, we wouldn't need to confess our sins on a regular basis, I suspect. It's about going deeper. It is about developing an internal life, an honesty with self about who God created you to be, and then going about being that person. God created us to be human. The problem with defiling oneself is that it erodes at the underpinning of humanity that is our birthright. It erodes what God created us for. You see, God didn't make us for cheapness. God didn't make us for unkindness. Remember, this is the God who from our mother's arms has blessed us on our way with countless gifts of love. Just as behavior can leave us feeling a little less human than we know we are, just as a bad decision can leave us feeling a little less integrated with ourselves and each other, remember this: so too can kindness begin the restorative work of redemption. Not too long ago, I read an essay by the food writer Brett Martin about a lunch that he had with Jacques Pepin. Martin had, in his own words, endured an excruciatingly slow-motion breakup that he said left him living in the windowless basement of a friend's house in Brooklyn. He writes, "Mornings I lay in complete darkness, listening to the shuffling and creaking as he and his wife and 2 children prepared for the day. There had been a time when I felt close to that domestic future, but now the truth of my life had been revealed. I was no man, I was a troll in a cellar. But of all of the fallout, physical, psychological, and emotional, one effect was the most worrisome. He had lost his appetite. As a food writer, he took no pleasure in food. He had no desire to eat, even less to write about what he had consumed. But being broke does have a way of motivating us from time to time, and so he took a freelance piece from a friend at GQ magazine to interview one of the first celebrity chefs, Jacques Pepin, about his tips for designing a home kitchen. He began the interview by apologizing for taking up the chef's time. No, he said, don't be ridiculous. And then back and forth they went over the course of the next hour. Things like, get a gas stove but an electric oven. You want a freezer drawer, not side by side. I found this bit fascinating, by the way. Most kitchen gadgets, in Pepin's opinion, are useless. Back and forth they went. As he prepared to leave, Pepin's assistant asked if he wanted something to eat. Assuming it was just a courtesy, Martin returned to the courtesy, saying, "Will you join me?" Pepin, he wrote, looked at me as though I might have hearing problems. Of course, it's lunchtime. As they ate, the chef asked, "What do you think of the consommé?" In truth, it needed salt. But more than that, being treated as someone whose opinion mattered was balm for the hurts that he had endured. It was a salve on his weariness. And he noticed that as lunch progressed, his appetite started coming back. He was ravenous, and he said, "I ripped off great hunks of bread and slathered them with pâté. I gnawed the bones of the lamb chops." If Pepin noticed, he said, he didn't say. It's amazing what a good meal can do for us. Even more, it's amazing what a meal seasoned with human kindness can do for us. That is, dear friend, what we are made for. Human kindness. Defilement is anything that violates that God-given reality. It's amazing what a good meal can do when it is seasoned with human kindness. The table is now set for you and me, a meal that invites us to come and to be restored in every way that we need to be restored. So, beloved children of God, I do hope we will all wash our hands when they need to be washed, but so much more than that. I hope that as we come to this table, we will remember that we are God's beloved children, created with meaning and purpose for a life authentically human, marked out with the sharing of divine kindness. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.